Hello and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm Tom Switzer and it's always lovely to have your company. Well, John Mearsheimer is one of the world's most distinguished foreign policy intellectuals. He's been a professor of political science at the University of Chicago for decades. His prominent books include The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that was published in 2001, and The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities, that was published in 2019. John was a guest at CIS back in 2019 when he spoke to sold-out events in both Sydney and Canberra. And last year, in a virtual CIS forum, John debated the prominent former Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani on the question, has China won? Well, rarely in history has an academic been as intellectually vindicated as our guest. As I wrote in the Australian newspaper in 2020, quote, 2 decades ago, Mearsheimer's bold thesis was that great power rivalry was not over. Like many prophets, Mearsheimer was ignored, but he accurately foresaw the intense Sino-American security competition that the coronavirus crisis has exposed. And with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor John Mearsheimer back to CIS. Hi there, John.
Hello, Tom. I'm glad to be back.
Well, John, in the current edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, that's the November-December 2021 edition, it's titled The Inevitable Rivalry, America, China and the Tragedy of Great Power Politics. You make a provocative thesis. Summarise succinctly your argument.
Basically, the article deals with how the United States dealt with China during the unipolar moment, from the time the Cold War ended up until President Trump took office in January 2017. And my basic argument is that in the last decade of the Cold War, it made eminently good sense for the United States to ally itself with China and to help China grow economically, because that would make China more powerful and it would allow China to be a good ally for purposes of balancing against the Soviet Union. But then when the Cold War ended in 1989, the question on the table was, how should the United States think about dealing with China? And the fact is that China was a very poor country in 1989, but it had a huge population advantage over the United States. And therefore, there was a real danger if we helped China grow economically, given its population advantage, if it became rich, if it became prosperous with all those people, it would be a threat to the United States. In effect, it would be a peer competitor. What happened over the course of the 90s, and really the first 20 years of this new century, is that the United States foolishly pursued a policy of engagement which was designed to make China richer, to make it wealthier. Just very important to understand that we helped China, we, the United States, and of course the Australians, the Japanese, and so forth and so on, went along with us. We made China into a powerful country in East Asia. And China is now at a point where it is determined to dominate all of Asia, to become a regional hegemon. The United States, of course, and the Australians are bent on preventing China from dominating Asia for good strategic reasons. But the end result of all this is that we're effectively in a new Cold War. We have an intense security competition on our hands, and this is a very dangerous competition.
Okay, so succinctly summarise, your argument is that once China grew wealthy as a result of Western engagement, particularly US engagement in the 1990s and the 2000s, that a US-China great power competition was inevitable. And had US policymakers understood the realist logic, your logic, John, of great power conflict in the early 1990s, they would have tried to slow down Chinese growth and maximise the power gap between Beijing and Washington. That's your line, right?
That's exactly right, Tom. And the fact is, as you well know, in the early 1990s, most people thought that realism was dead, or that balance of power politics was dead. Great power war was off the table forever, and that people like me were dinosaurs. So when I made the argument loudly and clearly starting in early 2001 that we were in trouble and we should do what we can to slow down China, nobody wanted to hear that argument.
Okay, so instead of fostering harmonious relations between China and the US, as the conventional wisdom said it would in the 1990s and 2000s, all engagements done is led to this intense security competition. The question here is, what course then should have been conducted, and how would that have changed where we are now?
Well, it's very important to understand that in 1990, China was a backward country economically. It had 1/75th the per capita GNP of the United States. And per capita GNP is a really good indicator of just how wealthy a country is. So this was a backward country, but it was deeply committed to growing economically, to becoming prosperous. So the question is, what should the United States do? A good realist like me would say that it's obvious that what the United States should do is do everything possible to slow down Chinese economic growth. And here we're talking about the fact that China depended on US markets, US technology, and US capability to grow. And with regard to those markets, we should have gone to great lengths to slow down trade with China, to not give them any special deals, which we did do. We certainly should have not welcomed them into the WTO. And as far as technology is concerned, we should have gone to great lengths to prevent technology transfers to China. And we should have gone to great lengths to limit foreign direct investment in China. And we did none of those things. And in fact, we did the opposite.
And the result is we're now in deep trouble, you say, and there is little we can do to change the situation. Tell us more.
Look, the fact is, Tom, from Beijing's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to want to dominate Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese have no interest in having the Americans in their backyard any more than we, the United States, have an interest in having China in our backyard. That's why we have the Monroe Doctrine. So once you take a country with that large a population and you make it really wealthy, it is going to have the wherewithal to take efforts or to take measures to try to dominate its region of the world. And of course, the United States is going to try to prevent that. So what we did was we created a situation where China was powerful enough, or is powerful enough, to try to dominate Asia.
You make the point, obviously, that as a result of all this, Washington and Beijing will now wage a very intense security competition that can best be managed on the margins to prevent disaster. We'll get to that later on, but let's test your thesis and go back to the 1990s, John. Of course, this is the time of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Charles Krauthammer coined the unipolar moment to describe an era of US primacy in the international system. Our old friend Frank Fukuyama, the end of history, all of that. And there was a bipartisan consensus, a very strong bipartisan consensus in Washington, in Canberra, indeed most of the West, that believed that we needed to integrate China into the global economy. And this was a view held by liberals as well as conservatives on left and right of the political spectrum. And of course, at the time, this was a tremendous economic opportunity that China presented to the West. The question here is, what did the widespread rejection of everything you've been saying, of strategic realism, what did the widespread rejection of realism tell us about Western public discourse during the 1990s and the 2000s?
I think there are 2 points here. The first is, I think that the Frank Fukuyama view of the world won out once the Cold War ended. People in the West believe that the United States and its allies had fought fascism in the first half of the 20th century and defeated it, And then in the second half, we, mainly in the West here, and this would include countries like Japan and Australia as part of the West, I'm using that term loosely, that we had defeated communism. And that what the future held in store was nothing but liberal democracy. As time went by, more and more countries would become liberal democracies. To put it in slightly different terms, we had the wind at our back. And people like me who argued that realism was still alive, great power politics would still matter in the future, were seen as dinosaurs, people who had an outdated view of international politics. So the fact is, Tom, there was absolutely no chance, given how people were thinking at the time, that we could sell an argument that it made sense to slow down Chinese economic growth. And in fact, most people believed that if China grew economically, it would eventually become a liberal democracy. And because liberal democracies don't engage in violations of human rights, and because liberal democracies don't fight each other, once China was a liberal democracy, we would all live happily ever after. This is the story that people told themselves.
Yeah, we told that at CIS. We're a classical liberal think tank. We subscribe to that orthodoxy too. In fact, we were unashamedly championing it.
No, of course, that's true. I think, by the way, that you basically thought my views didn't make a lot of sense in the early 2000s. When you first heard them. And I think that was true of most people.
But see, a lot of people listening into this would say, quite rightly, if we followed your approach in the 1990s and the 2000s, what effect would have that had on the economies of the US, Australia, Japan, and other countries that engage heavily with China? That would have hurt us, surely, economically.
Well, first of all, with regard to China, it would have delayed for a long time the point at which China became a great power. Remember, during the Cold War, China was not a great power. We lived in a bipolar world. There were two great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. So China was not a great power in 1990. It would have taken much longer than it has for China to become a great power. And furthermore, I believe once it became a great power, let's say that happened in 2025 or 2030, that great power would have been much weaker than the one that we're facing today. So we could have slowed down Chinese economic growth and delayed its achievement of great power status. Okay. Now, your point is that the United States and Australia and Japan would have suffered as a result of this. I think there is some truth in that. There is no doubt that we would not be as prosperous today as we are. But we would not have suffered as much as China did. And the relative power gap, which is of enormous importance, the relative power gap would have been much more favorable for the United States, for Australia, and for Japan. And that matters greatly. We would not have created, Tom, a peer competitor.
Yeah. And your argument is that essentially in the 90s and 2000s, we in the West were feeding the beast. I get that. But let's return to 2021 and that beast. You argue in Foreign Affairs magazine, quote, this Sino-American rivalry will test US policymakers more than the original Cold War did, as China is likely to be a more powerful competitor than the Soviet Union in its prime. That's what you say in Foreign Affairs magazine. But let me put this to you, John. The Soviet Union was physically located in Europe and East Asia and directly adjacent to the Persian Gulf. Thus, the US competed with Moscow in all three regions, okay? However, China is physically located in Asia alone, and there's a long distance from those other two strategically important regions. So the question here is, why do you think this Cold War will test policymakers more than the last Cold War? John Mearsheimer.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Tom, that your description of the Soviet Union is correct. And the United States did have its hands full dealing with the Soviet Union in the sense that it was physically located both in Europe and Asia and adjacent to the Gulf, as you say, and China's not. But that's not the most important dimension of the conflict. What makes the conflict between China and the United States more dangerous than the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union has to do with where the central focus of the competition was during the first Cold War and where it is during the second Cold War. During the first Cold War, Asia and the Gulf did not matter that much. The focus of US attention was on the central front in Europe. Most of Soviet military power was concentrated in Europe. Most of American military power was concentrated in Europe. That was the focal point. The focal point today is in East Asia, as you said, almost exclusively, and it involves places like Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. And my argument, Tom, is that during the Cold War, it was highly unlikely that we would have a war in Central Europe at that focal point, in large part because both sides had massive armies, massive amounts of tactical air, and were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. Therefore, it was difficult, almost impossible, to imagine those two military forces crashing into each other. So the Cold War number one, was dangerous for sure, but it was not that dangerous because the focal point, the central front, would have resulted in a conflict that was so horrible that it was hard to imagine getting it started to begin with. Now, let's move to East Asia today. Very different situation. There's no central front. The points of potential conflict are places like the South China Sea, the East China Sea, where you have these rocks that the Japanese and the Chinese fight over, and then Taiwan. Those are the three focal points in East Asia. Well, it's easy to imagine a war breaking out between the United States and China over those three pieces of real estate, in large part because it would not involve a massive conflict involving large armies and thousands of nuclear weapons. This is why everybody today is talking about the danger of a war over Taiwan, or the danger of a war over the South China Sea. So this new Cold War is going to be more dangerous than the first Cold War, which is not to say it is axiomatic that this Cold War, the new one, will become a hot war. But I'm just saying, I believe it's more likely than the first Cold War because of the geography.
As you say, accidents or miscalculations in the Taiwan Straits or the East and South China Seas, goodness, what could happen? But what about China? Some of our members and colleagues say that there's a real danger here that people like you are overstating China's strengths and you're overlooking its weaknesses and limitations. Let me put a few things to you. China faces a litany of these domestic challenges, John. Sluggish growth, an ever-increasing debt burden, China's stalling population growth. Add to this, China faces mounting environmental concerns and, of course, an energy crisis as we speak that is forcing power rationing to be implemented across the country. Question, won't these domestic challenges constrain China's ability to fulfill its strategic ambitions?
I think there's no doubt that they will constrain them. The $64,000 question, as we used to say when I was a kid, is how much they will constrain them. If you believe that these problems that you described are going to greatly damage Chinese economic growth in future years, that they are in effect going to hit the flat of the curve, then you're right that that's going to make it almost impossible for China to dominate Asia. I hope that happens. I'm hoping that the Chinese economy hits the flat of the curve. The last thing I want to see is the Chinese economy grow by 5 to 6% annually for the next 2 or 3 decades. That would not be good from an American or an Australian point of view. But I am not confident that China is going to hit the flat of the curve. The Chinese have done an impressive job of fostering economic growth for at least the last 30 years. And I see no reason to be confident that the scenario you describe will happen, while nevertheless hoping you're right.
And we should also stress that this is a country that is pumped up on nationalism, as you have made clear in your various writings. Now, we have a question here from Stephen Loosely, longtime friend and supporter of CIS, and he asks, is the trajectory of Chinese strategic policy inextricably linked to the leadership and personality of one Xi Jinping?
No. As a good realist, I believe that what is driving the train here is the structure of the international system. I believe that if you, Tom Switzer, were in charge in Beijing today, that you would behave hardly differently from the way Xi Jinping.
Oh, I am a classical liberal, John.
I believe that even if you were a classical liberal, listen, let's talk a second about Joe Biden. When Joe Biden got elected president, he had been a classical liberal. He had been a staunch proponent of engagement as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and when he was vice president under Barack Obama. So he was a staunch liberal. What happened when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump? Did he go back to those liberal policies, or did he continue the more realist policies of Donald Trump? The answer is he's followed in Trump's footsteps. So I think you, the liberal, Tom Switzer, if you were placed in charge in Beijing, you would behave largely the way Xi Jinping is behaving.
Just be careful when you call me a liberal. It's not an American liberal. It's a classical liberal in the Enlightenment European sense, but I get your point. But back to the point, the Xi Jinping, because a lot of commentators in Australia try to explain the new, more menacing, more assertive China because of its leader. You're saying it's the structure of the system that's at play.
Listen, in the West, this includes Australia and the United States, most commentators refuse to accept basic realist logic, and they end up defining the behavior of particular leaders in terms of their personality or their ideology. All sorts of people are going to argue that China is aggressive because it's not a democracy. It's not like the United States. My argument is just look at how the United States has behaved.
Okay, but let's talk about the United States. I mean, obviously, to keep in check China's regional ambitions, the US needs to be deeply committed to the Indo-Pacific region. I mean, is this likely? We have several Australian skeptics in this country, John. The academic historian James Curran, the Lowy Institute's Sam Roggeveen, for instance, they say America lacks the resolve to be seriously engaged in the region. After all, America is deeply divided and polarized. Are those doubts about US staying power justified?
No, I think that all of the available evidence is that the United States is committed to upping the ante in East Asia. Just look at what's happening with regard to US-Taiwanese relations. The United States is moving closer and closer to a firm commitment to defend Taiwan no matter what. Could you ask for better evidence that we are not going home? Furthermore, with regard to Afghanistan, a lot of Australians and a lot of people around the world say this is evidence that the United States has lost its will to fight around the world, that it's, going home. This is evidence of isolationist America at play. This is ridiculous. Australians should be thrilled that the United States ended the war in Afghanistan, not only because it was a stupid war to begin with and it was a lost war, but also because it now frees us up to concentrate more resources on East Asia. more resources to containing China, which is in Australia's interest.
In your foreign affairs essay, John, you say the US, quote, sees China's ambitions as a direct threat and is determined to check the country's continued rise. That's your line. But several American foreign policy realists whom you know very well, Professor Barry Posen, Andy Basovich, Mike Desch, among others, they don't want to contain China. And moreover, let me push this back to you. You might call it an isolationist argument, but it's quite plausible when you think about it. Isn't the US secure because it's separated from the world by these two giant oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean? It also has a vast nuclear arsenal, which of course is the ultimate deterrent. Plus, there's a strong isolationist tradition in America, as you well know. So why should the US, given all of this, go to great lengths to check China's regional ambitions? John.
I think that theoretically, you can make a powerful case for isolationism. I think you can argue that the United States is manifestly secure in the Western Hemisphere. It has two giant moats to its east and to its west. It has thousands of nuclear weapons.
That's my point. Yeah.
That's right. You can make that case. But the fact is, nobody is seriously arguing that the United States should adopt an isolationist policy, number one. And number two, what people should care about is not what the chattering classes are saying. Who cares what the chattering classes are saying? The question is, what is the deep state doing? We just want to know, what is Joe Biden and company doing? And the answer is that Joe Biden and company, just like Donald Trump and company, are deeply committed to containing China. You know, I hear all this talk about Taiwan. People are saying, should we defend Taiwan or not? This is a meaningless debate. The train has left the station. We are defending Taiwan. We meaning the United States, period. End of story. The deep state has decided that. So all this talk about isolationism and restraint in terms of dealing China is, to me, largely of interest to the chattering classes, but is not meaningful.
Yeah, and in fairness to your thesis, the Quad, US, Australia, India, Japan, AUKUS, this is the recent US, UK, Australia security arrangement, that reaffirms your point about the US commitment to the region. And polls show in this country, John, in Australia, AUKUS is overwhelmingly popular. But not everyone agrees. The former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was our Prime Minister from 1991 to 1996, he says the agreement constitutes, quote, a dramatic loss of Australian sovereignty because, quote, it would rob Australia of freedom of choice in a future conflict where the US goes to war. Keating's not alone. Reassure those Australians who are worried about the loss of Australian sovereignty as a result of getting too close to Uncle Sam.
Well, I disagree with Mr. Keating's rhetoric. The fact is, Australia is not giving up its sovereignty. It's not giving up its right to choose what kind of foreign policy it wants. It's not giving up its right to choose whether it wants to ally with the United States or China. Australia is free to align with China if it wants. Australia is free to sit on the sidelines if it wants. You're not giving up your sovereignty. What's happening here is Australians, or at least the deep state in Australia, has decided that it is in Australia's interest to align with the United States. That's why you're doing it. And it makes perfect sense. The United States has decided that it's in its interest to contain China. And I think if you go back to the Australian case and what Keating said, he's wrong when he says that Australia is abandoning its sovereignty or giving up its sovereignty. It's not. It's just made a particular choice.
Keating also says that in a Western Pacific conflict, John, the US would have little chance against China with its supply chain far too strained. Now, you debated Kishore Mahbubani on a CIS YouTube event last year, more than 440,000 views, and asking the question, has China won? So are Keating and Mahbubani right here? Is Australia backing the wrong horse? John Mearsheimer.
I think the argument that China is going to whip the United States is not a serious argument. That may be true in 20 or 30 years. The United States is the most powerful state on the planet militarily at this point in time. It has huge numbers of resources in Asia at this point in time. If you talk about the balance between submarines on the Chinese side and on the American side, it favors us decisively. The fact that we control Taiwan makes it remarkably difficult for China to project power beyond the first island chain. I don't want to argue that China has no military capabilities. I don't want to argue that China wouldn't put up a good fight against the United States today. But the argument that we're a pushover, we the Americans are a pushover, and the Chinese could easily dispose of us in a fight is not a serious argument.
Okay, what about the views of another former Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, who died in 2015. I'm just putting these views to you to test your thesis because Keating and Fraser, although they represent a minority viewpoint, they nevertheless represent a very loudy viewpoint, particularly in certain media segments. Fraser's interesting because he told me before he died that he was a massive supporter of your work, John, on Russia, NATO and Ukraine, and he strongly admired your strong opposition to the Iraq invasion of 2003. He was, if you like, a bit of a Mearsheimer groupie. But this is what he said before he died in 2015.
People do not realize the extent to which we have been entwined in the United States policy in the last 15 or 20 years. At a time when the Cold War is over, the United States is now in the process of establishing a new Cold War in the Pacific. Her military policies failed in Vietnam, failed in Iraq, failing in Afghanistan. The Middle East is a mess, and leaving all that behind, they say they're going to shift their forces to the Western Pacific. We are part of this part of the world, and we don't want to be part of America's future mistakes in this region. But has the government been frank with Australians, saying where it might lead, saying that we're going to be asked to pay for a lot of it? It's America trying to tie us into their policy of containment, which is about the most dangerous position Australia could possibly be in.
That's the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, just before he died in 2015. John Mearsheimer.
Well, I think where Mr. Fraser is absolutely correct, and it's why our views were simpatico, has to do with wars in developing countries like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We should have never gone to war and engaged in regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we should have never entered the Vietnam War in 1965. And I think he and I are on the same page with regard to those conflicts. However, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about great power competition. We're talking about the United States up against peer competitors. We're talking about the United States up against potential hegemons in places like Asia and Europe. And the United States has gone up against 4 potential peer competitors in the past: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. In all 4 cases, the United States prevailed. We have a fundamentally different track record when it comes to great power politics than we do when it comes to intervening in developing countries and trying to do regime change. What we're doing with regard to China is not synonymous with what we did in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, thank goodness. It's synonymous with what we did with the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan. And there we have a good track record. This is not to say we will ultimately be successful in the decades ahead against China. Who knows how this one will play itself out? I would not bet against the United States, but our track record here is much better. Now, with regard to his last point, that this is a very dangerous situation and that he as an Australian is very disturbed by the idea that Australia is getting dragged into this security competition, this dangerous security competition between the United States and China, I don't blame him one bit. If I were an Australian, I'd feel the same way. Yeah. But the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the alternative?
Yeah.
And the fact
Yep, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but are we alone here, though? I mean, another critic, Hugh White, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, whom you know, and you debated him at a CIS event in Canberra in 2019 in front of 500 people. Terrific night, John. But this is what he told the ABC's 7:30 recently.
The fact is that most other countries in Asia don't share our approach and America's approach to China. So I think in Southeast Asia, and for that matter further north, there'll be a lot of people who'll look at this. They might not complain about it out loud, but they'll look at it and see it as a negative development because it further entrenches the idea that we've got a new Cold War in Asia with America on the one side and China on the other. They're stuck in the middle. They don't want to choose. They see that Australia has made a choice.
Now, that's Professor Hugh White, again on the ABC. John Mearsheimer, is that true? Are we Australians more outspoken in our support for the US alliance than other Asian states?
Well, I think if you look at the Quad, there are 3 Asian states that have basically made it clear that they're with the United States. They've chosen sides. That's Japan, India, and Australia. So I think there is a certain element of truth in what you said. Those other countries, right, and this includes countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam, which I believe will eventually move decisively to the American side, are trying to straddle the fence. And I don't blame them, right? You saw this with Australia for many years. The Australians did not want to be forced to pick sides. And it's completely understandable. So there are a number of countries, as you points out, that are straddling the divide. And eventually they will be forced to pick sides. There's no way the South Koreans and the Filipinos are not going to be forced to pick sides. And the Vietnamese, they're moving gingerly, as are the Singaporeans and others. But they understand that I believe, that in the end, it's in their interest to side with the United States.
And this is part of your argument that America will increasingly form a coalition of states in the region to balance, check, contain China. Now, it is an increasingly intense Sino-American security competition. And one power that could be useful in being a counterweight to China, of course, is Russia. But as we know, during the Trump era, we're all too often told that the Putin regime is a thuggish, corrupt, and of course, Russia has shown it will play hardball to protect vital strategic interests in its near abroad. Why do you think Washington is capable of winning over the Russians in a balancing coalition against China?
Well, I'm not sure at the moment that we could win over the Russians. I think we made an egregious error in alienating Russia in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. I think what's happened is terrible because we have in effect, we the Americans have in effect driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese.
So NATO expansion, all that, yep.
Yes, it was NATO, it was a combination of 3 factors: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolutions. We threatened the Russians in ways that angered them greatly, led to the war in Georgia in August of 2008, and then led to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, which broke out in February 2014.
Yeah, but just a quick time out, John. But see, a lot of our critics would say, are you being too soft on Russia and you're being too hard on China? You're basically saying the Americans pushed the American security guarantees right up to Russia's doorstep, upsetting the sensibilities of Moscow, but you're also saying America should be tougher on China. So some of your critics might say you're being inconsistent here.
Yeah, but the problem with my critics is they're not thinking in terms of balance of power logic. The fact is that Russia is not a potential hegemon in Europe or in Asia. Russia is a declining great power. It's not a threat to us, meaning the Americans, certainly the Australians, in any meaningful way.
Well, it's a giant gas station that's holding Europe to ransom during this energy crisis.
That may be true, but who cares? That is not strategically important for the United States. What we care about is whether or not Russia has the capability to dominate Asia the way China looks like it's going to have the capability to dominate Asia. That's the key issue on the table. We're not dealing with the Soviet Union here. We're dealing with Russia. And the fact is that relations between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States are terrible today, in large part because of the West's policy towards Russia, and especially American policy towards Russia. And your question is, can we turn this around?
Yes. What about India as a counterweight, John? Raja Mahan, one of India's most distinguished security experts, he's in the process of writing a paper for CIS, and it's tentatively called Between Geography and History, Delhi and Canberra in Indo-Pacific Security. Members should stay tuned for that paper by Professor Moham. And his point is this, let me read this out to you. The whole idea of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct is about A, recognising that the old framework of US alliances in the region and ASEAN multilateralism are no longer enough to secure the regional order, and B, that the US has worked hard to bring India, the only rising great power with a scale to match China, into the equation to help balance and deter China. What about India, John?
Well, I agree with what Raj says. The fact is that China is a threat, not just in East Asia, which is what you and I have been talking about in large part because we have an Australia-centric focus in this discussion, as well as an American-centric focus. But the fact is that China is a threat to India, and it's a threat to India up in the Himalayas. There's a huge border dispute between India and China that is yet to be settled. And furthermore, China will eventually be a threat to India in the Indian Ocean because the Chinese are building a blue water navy that's designed to project power into the Persian Gulf. So the Indians are deeply concerned about China. And what we're trying to do with the creation of this notion of an Indo-Pacific theater is we're trying to tie East Asia and India together. And we want India to help as much as possible in East Asia. And of course, we want these countries in East Asia to help India as much as possible. And of course, the Americans are the critical actor here because they have the military capability to throw their weight around both in the Indian Ocean and in East Asia. But that's what's going on here. And just think about the Quad. Who are the four countries in the Quad? Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. So you see very clearly how we're trying to sort of stitch together an alliance structure that includes not just East Asia, but the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific.
John, let's turn to some questions from some of our CIS members. Andrew is a leading business figure in the Sydney financial markets community. And he just asks, why should Australia so openly support the US in its security competition with our largest trade partner? And Andrew goes on to say, can't we in Australia, like the Europeans, effectively sit on the sidelines? Andrew asks, why anger China and hurt our trade prospects, which has helped sustain Australian prosperity? John Mearsheimer.
Well, for Australians, you have a simple choice here. For economic reasons, for purposes of maintaining your prosperity, it makes more sense to side with the Chinese than with the Americans. But from a security point of view, it makes eminently good sense for Australia to side with the United States. China is a threat to Australia. If China were to ever dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, this would be terrible news for Australia. And I believe deep down, all Australians know that, right? So you have a choice here, and the choice is a rather simple one. And the choice has been made. You're going to ally with the United States. And as I said before, I think most countries in East Asia will do the same. Europe is in a fundamentally different situation. It goes back to your point, Tom, that China is not a threat in Europe, and it is not, at this point in time anyway, a threat in the Persian Gulf, right? China is a threat in East Asia and in the Indian region, right? That's where it is a threat now, in the Indo-Pacific region. So the Europeans can afford not to worry about China as a military threat. And they can trade with China, right? They could think that they could have their cake and eat it too. The Americans will provide security for them. NATO will remain intact, and they can continue to trade with China. Whereas the Australians and the countries in East Asia are in a much more difficult situation.
So geography explains the difference between Europe and Australia. I get that. Geography, the Europeans are much less dependent on the US for its protection than Australia. But just say the Europeans cozy up to Beijing on the economic front, as they did late last year when they signed that commercial agreement with China. And if the Europeans get even closer to China, how do you think the Americans will treat the Europeans, who have been a long-time strategic ally?
Well, it will enrage the Americans. I mean, you're basically positing a scenario where the Europeans do things economically that will help China to grow economically more powerful.
Feeding the beast.
They'll feed the beast. That's right. And I think that there is a reasonable possibility that some European countries, maybe many European countries, especially Germany, will feed the beast. And I think this will enrage the Americans. And then you have to ask yourself, Tom, what are the consequences for NATO? What are the consequences for transatlantic relations if that happens? Because you want to understand, if they do feed the beast and the beast continues to grow, the United States has then powerful incentives to move more resources out of Europe to East Asia for purposes of containing that growing beast.
Indeed, and let's remember, most of those NATO states still refuse to pay the 2% of the GDP on defence. Good point, John. Now, here's a question from my colleague, Sue Windybank here at CIS, whom you met when you were out here 2 years ago, John. She says, you say, John, that as China becomes richer and more powerful, it's acting just like the United States did throughout its history. One parallel I find, this is Sue, I find striking is that today, China talks increasingly of a new vision for leading reform of global governance, a common destiny for mankind. That's the destiny that will be decided in Beijing. Sue asked the question, is China now developing a theology of exceptionalism to justify its bid for hegemony, just as the United States portrays itself as a force for good in bringing freedom and democracy to the world? That is, it talks like a liberal and acts like a realist. Are we seeing the same dynamics at play in China? John?
I think Sue's absolutely right that the Chinese are talking about themselves as if they are an exceptional country. But I would argue that this has a long-standing tradition in the Middle Kingdom, so to speak. The Chinese have always viewed themselves as having a superior culture. They view themselves as being exceptional, just like the Americans view themselves as being exceptional. And both countries are now playing that card and will continue to play that card. The big difference, however, is that the Americans have always been remarkably adroit when it comes to soft power and selling the American way of life, selling American culture abroad. The Chinese, on the other hand, and you see this with their wolf diplomacy, have really done a terrible job on the soft power front. And when I look at how the Chinese have dealt with Australia over the past few years, I really scratch my head and say, what are the Chinese thinking? They've purposely alienated Australians. They've made it very difficult for Australians to make the case that they should side with China over the United States with this wolf warrior diplomacy. So on the exceptionalism point, I think Sue's exactly right. But on the soft power side of things, which I think matters even more, the Americans have done much better over time, Donald Trump notwithstanding, at selling the American way of life, at selling American culture abroad.
Following that, Bruce McKern, one of our longtime members, has asked, I think it's a tongue-in-cheek question, but I might be wrong, Bruce. This is the question. It goes like this. Should Australia have warned those wolf warrior diplomacy threats and just pay tribute to Beijing and accept the 12 demands that the Chinese government made on our relationship and just withdraw from AUKUS?
No. The Australians did the right thing. My view, as you know, Tom, has long been that it's in Australia's interest when security is a salient issue to side with the United States. I think there's no question, going back to Malcolm Fraser's rhetoric, that Australia has to be careful when you're dealing with the United States. The United States tends to be a rogue elephant. Great powers tend to be rogue elephants, the United States included. So Australia wants to go to great lengths to make sure that as it gets close to that rogue elephant, it doesn't end up in a situation where the rogue elephant rolls over on top of Australia and does great damage.
Okay, question here from Alison, though. Aren't China's strategic objectives limited to its near periphery, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Xinjiang? This is her argument. Aren't you overstating China's capacity and intent to threaten the sovereignty of countries in like far away Australia?
No, I think that what's going to happen here is that China is going to imitate the United States. It's very important to understand that I'm basically arguing here that China is operating according to balance of power logic, just the way the United States did when it created hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Australia, right? Australia is in East Asia, and the Chinese want to dominate East Asia. This is not to say they want to invade Australia and run its politics, right? But what they want to do is push the Americans out of East Asia. They want to be by far the most powerful in East Asia, and they want to have a say in Australian domestic politics, just the way the United States has a say in the politics of every country in the Western Hemisphere. It is not the case that every country in the Western Hemisphere can have its own foreign policy. If you decide that you're going to have your own foreign policy, you are going to pay a really serious price. And if you have any doubts about that, look at what's happened to Cuba since roughly 1959, when Castro effected a revolution in that country.
Or indeed Venezuela in more recent times.
Exactly. And that's what Australia has to worry about. It's right. And furthermore, you want to remember that if China were to dominate East Asia militarily, and there was no United States, let's assume the Americans went home, China over time would develop really formidable military forces that it could use to coerce countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia.
Okay, another question. Anthony Carr, another long-time member of CIS. Thanks for tuning in, Anthony. He asks a cheeky question, but it's a good one, John. Puts you on the spot here. If the deep state got it so wrong about China during the 1990s and the 2000s and 2010s, the high point of engagement, can we expect the now discredited deep state to get China right in the future?
Well, I think I have a one-word answer to that. Hopefully.
Well, your point's the structure and the system, isn't it? That's the point. Yeah.
Look, the truth is, Tom, as you and I have talked about before, during the unipolar moment when the United States was super powerful, it was possible for American elites, American foreign policy elites, to have delusions about international politics. You could believe the kinds of ideas that Frank Fukuyama was purveying. You could do that because we were so powerful. However, that world has gone away. Yep. We are now in a very different world. We're in a multipolar world where there's one particular country out there, China, that is a peer competitor of the United States, and that is focusing the mind.
Another question from Kevin. I don't think it's an old sparring partner of yours, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, who has actually spoken at CIS many, many years ago. But he asked this question, Kevin, many of us liberals believe that international institutions are vital in maintaining a rules-based liberal international order. It's this system, John Mearsheimer, not the 19th century power politics that you talk about. It's the liberal international system that in the 21st century will provide a balancing mechanism to constrain state actors. So why can't a UN-led system keep in check a rising China? John?
Well, I think that the problem with Kevin's comment is that he is trying to separate great power politics from rules and from norms. And what you want to remember is that we had rules and norms galore in the 20th century. We had many, many institutions in the 20th century, and institutions are basically rules. But the key point is it's the great powers who write the rules. It's just very important to understand that. The United States loves rules because the United States gets to write the rules. What's going on with China today is China's trying to write new rules. And furthermore, what happens is that when the great powers don't like the rules, they violate the rules. So rules are inextricably bound up with great power politics. Now, Kevin talks about the United Nations. He talks about the United Nations like the United States has divisions of its own. He talks about the United Nations like there's this institution out there that has 20 armored division equivalents. Nothing could be further from the truth. The United Nations is comprised of the countries around the world, right, that have come together to form this institution. China and the United States are part of the UN, right? And so when you talk about the UN doing something, you're talking about China and the United States doing something. It's China and the United States who bring force to the UN. And the UN is not going to be able to do anything to contain China because it has no divisions and because China is part of the UN.
Yeah, an old mutual friend of ours who passed away last year, Owen Harries, who was a senior fellow at CIS in the 2000s, he once said that the United Nations does not replace power politics, it disguises power politics.
Owen was a very wise man, and I think his words hit the nail right on the head.
Well, John, we are out of time. The Foreign Affairs essay, this is in the next edition of Foreign Affairs, the November-December 2021 edition. The title is called The Inevitable Rivalry, America, China and the Tragedy of Great Power Politics. John, on behalf of CIS members, my staff and our board, it's always a thrill and honour to have you with us at CIS. Thanks so much for being with us today.
It was my pleasure, Tom, and thank you for having me on the show.
Well, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound classical liberal principles. To be notified of future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.